Hello, this is Michael Tellinger, and I'd like to take a journey of discovery with you to look into the ancient past and see what kind of wisdom we can pick up from the ancient civilizations. Wisdom and information and knowledge that we could possibly put to the use of humankind today and into the future. I've been traveling around the world and doing these lectures on the origins of humankind and a new social structure called Ubuntu and contributionism since 2006. And what I find is that there's a 100% level of dissatisfaction with the people that I come face to face with. I've been asking the same question over and over again to all the people in 10 years that I've been talking to and connecting with. And that question is, how many of you are happy with the way the world is going? How many of you are happy with your life? How many of you believe that you're fulfilling your life's dreams? How many of you believe that the governments are doing a great job and serving the people that they're supposed to serve? And in 10 years, I can tell you that not one person has ever put up their hand to say that they are happy with what's going on in the world. So clearly we have a big problem, and we need to find solutions for this problem. And in this series, we're going to look into the past, learn from the ancient civilizations, discover some phenomenal and fascinating knowledge and information, and find a way to put that ancient knowledge to use for humanity into the future. While some of the knowledge and information we're going to find and discover might seem dark and sinister and depressing and quite scary at times, I'd like you to see it differently. I'd like you to see it as liberating and enlightening information that will give us the platform and the foundation to build a new social structure for humanity, a new foundation into the future based on real knowledge and information about the human race and the true history of this planet. So let's start this journey. What are we going to talk about in this series? We're going to talk about origins of humankind, ancient vanished civilization. We're going to talk about the advanced technology, which truly boggles the mind and shows us how little we really know. We're going to talk about gold and this fascination that humanity has had with gold for so many thousands of years, where that fascination comes from, and that we actually inherited this fascination from the gods, that it's not actually our obsession, that it's the obsession of the so-called gods that we inherited as the human race. We're going to talk about astronomy, we're going to talk about geology, archaeology, physics, mathematics, geophysics. We're going to talk about quantum physics and this thing called laws of nature, and this other interesting area of research called the nature of reality, if we can actually call it that, because we find out how little we really know about the laws of nature and this nature of reality that we find ourselves in. But the key thing that we need to do is, what are we going to do with this information? Because it's very good getting all this knowledge and information, but what do we do with this? If we don't put it to any good use for humanity and our planet and our future, it's all a bloody waste of time. So I suggest that we learn from the ancients, create this platform, and find a solution for this terrible situation that every single one of us finds ourselves in. So we're going to start this journey by connecting the dots and going back into the ancient past, looking back into history, like these famous statues on Easter Island are looking back into the past and into the future, and gain critical information that will allow us to build this platform. When we encounter these ancient civilizations, we find that they seem to have so much more knowledge and information about who we are as a species and our murky ancient history and the origins of humankind. And the one common denominator that I have found is that pretty much all ancient cultures that I've studied all tell us that we come from the stars. And yet that is not what our history books, our modern textbooks tell us. They will deny it until they're blue in the face. So let's learn from the ancients. Let's absorb this knowledge and information, and let's give our ancient civilizations the credit they deserve by learning from them. What seems to have become of humanity is that we've become a species with amnesia. because we know nothing about who we are, where we come from, and why we are here. And this species of amnesia seems to have spread right across the world, no matter where you are. The modern civilization today seems to suffer from the same disease. Now, how do you create a species with amnesia? It seems to me that this final assault on humanity to create a species with amnesia started around 500 years ago, when what I call the thugs from Europe started invading the free lands, the free world, invading the Americas, invading Africa and Asia and the Australias, and started taking control of the land of the native people, invading the land, planting their flags, and destroying all the knowledge that was held by those native people around the world, replacing their books, replacing their literature with Eurocentric history books, Eurocentric religions, and Eurocentric belief systems. And over a 500-year period, very smoothly, very gently, very subtly, and very cunningly created a species with amnesia, of whom we are all members of today. So, who are we? Where do we come from? Why are we here? The great human puzzle, the three questions that most of us have asked ourselves. And we find that when we look into the ancient past, the ancient cultures and civilizations have a lot of critical information for us on those subjects. Because if we don't know who we are and where we come from, how could we possibly think we know where we are going? And it's amazing when you start peeling away the layers of information and the deception through the millennia and the hundreds of years that preceded our current state of disinformation. The Gospel of Thomas is a phenomenal example. And in the Gospel of Thomas, there's an account of the disciples asking Jesus a question. And they ask him, "Tell us how our end will be." And Jesus replies a fascinating answer. He says, "Have you discovered then the beginning, that you look for the end? For where the beginning is, there will be the end. Blessed is he who will take his place in the beginning. He will know the end and will not experience death." Now, when we realize how little we know about our human history, certain things come to mind, and we start to remember that history is written by the victors. The fact that our history books that we are presented with at school and at universities are not really filled with knowledge and information, but is really an agenda that has been written by those that have won the conflicts and won the wars and taken control of our countries and our governments. So, if you talk to somebody that spews forth what they believe is knowledge and information from history books, just ask them, how much do you really know about our human history? And I can tell you that we know less about our human origins than is permissible by the laws of physics. This is a spectacular statement. How can we prove this? And this is a very simple mathematical equation that I'll share with you. But if history is written by the victors, how much do we really know about certain historic events like Alexander the Great? Who was he? What did he really do? All we know about Alexander, that he conquered the world and he invaded countries, raped and pillaged and took over people's lands and homes, and we call him great? Well, I don't think that's a label that deserves to be called great. And for example, the event of the Tower of Babel. How much do we really know about the events that surrounded the Tower of Babel, this famous historic event? We know very little. In fact, the biblical event that talks about the Tower of Babel is completely out of place and out of time, because during the time when Babylon was already an empire and the Tower of Babel was being built, people had already been speaking many languages around the world. So the concept of let us go down and destroy their language, for if they can do this, they can become like us, is a nonsensical statement. Because at that stage, the people were not just speaking one language, they were already speaking many languages. So clearly there's a deep deception encoded into that historic event. So let's continue with this historic expose. And when we go back in history and look at our history books, we learn from recent history, then we go further back in time, and suddenly at one point in time we stumble upon this very strict dividing line where our history becomes mythology. Well, who decides when history becomes mythology? When does history become mythology? Suddenly, we find that ancient cultures have these gods and these beings that they're fearful of, that they worship, and they bring food to. Well, I can tell you that the Roman gods were not imaginary beings. They were very real to the Romans. They feared them, they worshipped them, they fed them, and they obeyed them. The Greeks didn't think or believe that their gods were mythical or imaginary beings. They were very real to the Greeks, and so were the Sumerians and all other ancient cultures. And we realize that there's a very, very murky dividing line between where history ends and mythology begins. So let's go back some 6,000 years to what we perceive to be the beginning of the current modern civilization, right? To the Sumerians and those that just came before them, or that murky period in human history. And let's believe that at that point in human history, we had 100% of knowledge and information about who we are, where we come from, and why we're here as a species. And that every year we have one war. So one war per annum. That's being very kind and generous to history. And we only lose 50% of the information and knowledge by those that win the wars, and they only remove 50% of the knowledge, so there's only a 50% loss of knowledge and information. So if we go back 6,000 years, we start with 100% knowledge. 1 year later, 5,999 years ago, we already know 50% of what we knew the year before. And so we go. Knowledge and information gets degraded so quickly that by the time we get 7 or 8 years into this degradation of knowledge and information, we already know less than 1% of the original truth. By the time we get to 124 years into civilization, we know less than 10 to the minus 34 of the original truth. Now that's a big number. It's often referred to as Planck's constant, and possibly the smallest number in existence, and arguably, let's say that. And so what this really tells us, that 124 years into civilization, we know less about our human origins than is permissible by the laws of physics. So if anybody tells you that they know about history because they've read the history books, are barking up the wrong tree. We've all been lied to, we've all been deceived, and basically everything we've been told and taught is a lie. And we have to start from a clean slate. We have to start from a belief that we need to acquire a new body of knowledge and new information with a clean slate and start putting the pieces of the puzzle of our new knowledge, new body of information that'll give us a direction into the future for humanity and this planet of ours. One of the things we find when we start looking at the ancient history and ancient civilizations is that human history and the history of this planet is a lot older, a lot stranger, and far more exciting than most of us could ever imagine. It's like living in our own sci-fi movie, living in our own horror movie to some extent, but it's not what most of us believe it is. And the ancient sites that many of us are familiar with are much older than we can imagine. Stonehenge is one of the greatest examples. And if you just look at the erosion on the stones of Stonehenge, it'll give you a very clear hint. First of all, very few people are aware of the fact that Stonehenge was actually reconstructed in 1954. I personally believe it was a malicious attempt to make Stonehenge appear a lot more recent than it really is. But by simply looking at the stones, the giant megaliths that stand there, and the erosion on these stones, it clearly tells us that these are very ancient stones, an ancient site. The erosion is very, very old. You cannot have sarsen stone erode to such an extent in a few thousand years. And the example is the one tall stone in the middle of Stonehenge that fell over at some stage and broke. The erosion on that break is about 2 feet or 50 centimeters of erosion on a clean break of sarsen stone. It's impossible for sarsen stone to erode 50 centimeters or 2 feet in a few thousand years. So what I'm telling you is that Stonehenge is most likely more than 1 million years old. And the reconstruction of Stonehenge in 1954 was a malicious attempt to confuse us and to make us believe that human history is a lot younger than most of us can realize. One of the most popular books in the world, the Bible, tells us that when the gods were on earth, there were giants. Now, when you go down to the pub and you strike up a conversation with the guy next to you and you say, hey, how about those giants? They probably think you're talking about some sports team, right? But no, you'd be talking about the giants in human history. And this, when you bring up in conversation, normally brings up, laughter and people giggling and thinking you're joking. And yet, the Bible is full of references of giants in our history. In the book of Numbers, it says, but the people who lived there are powerful, and their cities are fortified and very large. And we even saw the descendants of Anak there. And it continues in Numbers 13:33. It says, we saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. What they're telling us is that we look like grasshoppers next to the giants. So how large would a giant be so that we look like grasshoppers next to them? Well, before I show you the evidence of that, let's first analyze what the Jewish Encyclopedia has to say about giants in the Bible. It says, according to rabbinical tradition, the ANAKIM are of the same titanic race as the Rephaim, the Nephilim, the Gibborim, the Zamzumim, and the Emim. Now, most people will say, well, I've heard of the Nephilim, I've heard of the Anakim, but that's where they normally come or fall short of understanding who the Zamzumim, the Emim, and the Gibborim are. And yet the Bible speaks openly about these beings, these titanic races that were giants, as if they knew exactly who they were, the way we would refer to the French, the Polish, and the Germans today, without defining who these people were. And these were giants in human history. The giants in human history goes back thousands and thousands of years, and all ancient cultures talk about giants in our history. Well, very close to where I live in South Africa, close to the Swaziland border, there's this phenomenal giant footprint left in rough granite. How the footprint can appear in rough granite is a deep mystery, and we will cover that later in the series, because most people will tell you it's impossible to leave a footprint in granite. Well, they would be wrong, and they just show their lack of understanding and the very little we know about geology and the formation of materials on this planet. So we'll cover that later. But this giant footprint is spectacular because my good friend KLAUS from Austria, who's an expert in ancient artifacts and mysterious objects, actually found the remains of a giant about 7.5 meters tall, or probably about 23, 25 foot tall, in Ecuador. He found a nose bone, a heel bone, and a skull fragment that were analyzed and genetically analyzed and confirmed that this was a humanoid that would have been about 7.5 meters tall. Now, this clearly is a beautiful example how little we know about our human history. The giants in history carries on, and at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa, where I graduated in 1983 with pharmaceutics, there is a fragment of a giant, a bone that is left behind. Originally, it was discovered in 1960 in Namibia, in an ancient mine in Namibia, and they found entire skeletons and many more bone fragments, but this is the only remaining piece, and it's kept in the vaults of the anthropological department of the University of Witwatersrand. It just shows you how these spectacular examples of giants are not on display for people to see, and they keep them away from sight to the public. The other famous ancient artifact that is kept in South Africa is at the museum in Port Elizabeth, the city of Port Elizabeth. And this is the famous BOSKOP skull. I had the privilege of actually seeing the BOSKOP skull next to a normal human skull. And it is estimated that these people were about 25 to 30% larger than normal human beings. And this, once again, these fragments of this BOSKOP skull are kept in a box in the basement of the museum, not on display for public to see. The famous elongated skulls that we find all over the world now, not just in South America or Mexico. We find them in the East, we've found them in Europe, And these kind of mysterious discoveries keep coming out of the woodwork on a regular basis, clearly indicating that the history of our planet is far more mysterious than most of us can realize. The famous discussion about AKHENATEN and NEFERTITI and who they really were, and were they part of the Nephilim, and all these speculations about who they really were. And then other strange looking creatures that just make no sense in the history of this planet based on our current understanding on the timelines, who we are, and the chronology of evolution of humanity. Just doesn't make any sense. Like this creature here, this humanoid with horns coming out of its skull. You know, what's going on here? Clearly we have a history here that we know nothing about. The giant gene seems to be encoded in our DNA, and every now and then giants just pop out when least expected. Here are some famous photographs from more recent times from the mounds of Ohio, and a giant found in the bogs of Ireland, just very, very large humanoids that will just be very swiftly removed from prying human eyes when they were discovered, never to be seen again. And at the heart of this seems to be the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian seems to be the culprit in removing all of this evidence of giants around the world. When you follow the trail, you'll see that they seem to always arrive on site and location and remove all the evidence, never to be found again. So giants in human history go back thousands of years. They are great examples that you can find when you start examining this, and it's not a hidden secret in alternative circles, but in mainstream history, mainstream archaeology, it is a taboo subject not to be discussed. This is a great example of a giant, probably about 5 meters or 15 feet tall. This bone was found by an American archaeologist in the 30s, somewhere in the Middle East, and then brought to the USA. This is a finger of a giant that was seen and photographed by a tourist by the name of George Spory in 1988. Apparently he paid $300 to see this giant mummified finger. How big is it? Well, have a look at the giant finger next to a 20-pound Egyptian note to give you an idea how large this individual would have been. And then we have the Egyptian paintings that show us the very large beings next to the very small beings. Some people say it's perspective. Well, I claim it's not. I believe that it's really showing us that there were very large beings and then very small beings or normal beings next to the giants that used to live in Egypt and that part of the world. And then the tiny humanoids that have been found around the world that clearly boggle our mind, just to highlight the fact how mysterious the history of this planet truly is. But some of the greatest mystery we find in ancient texts. The mystery that relates to who we are and where we come from and why we're here as a species. And then many of these texts are also filled with deceptions. I believe that one of the greatest deceptions that has been imposed on humanity comes in the most popular book on this planet, and that is the Bible. The opening phrase of the Bible has clearly been manipulated. We all believe that the opening phrase of the Bible says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." Well, that is no longer the case, because this man here, MICHEAL LEDWITH, who, as you can see, kept some very interesting company for 17 years of his life. He was the advisor to the popes at the Vatican. MICHEAL is a walking encyclopedia and one of the wisest men I've ever met. And he knows so much about this ancient history. He's a scholar of the Bible, scholar of the Hebrew language, and he found while he was studying that the opening text of the Hebrew Bible does not start with the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, Aleph, or the A in the Hebrew alphabet. All sacred texts must begin with the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, which is A, or Aleph. Well, at the moment, the current reading in Hebrew says, Barashit bara Elohim et ha-shamayim wa et ha-earis, which doesn't even make grammatical sense if you break it down. And we clearly see that the first statement in the Hebrew Bible starts with Beth, the second letter, or B, second letter of the alphabet, and that should not happen. When MICHEAL inserted A, or Aleph, it suddenly says Abba. Abba means father, and suddenly it changes that opening statement completely. It now says, the Father of the beginnings created the Elohim, the heavens, and the earth. What does that do? It changes everything. It suddenly brings Judeo-Christianity in line with all ancient cultures and ancient civilizations, when we know there is a Father of the beginnings, a source for all creation, and that source seems to be sound and resonance. And this resonates with all ancient civilizations when they tell us that everything was brought into creation by sound and resonance. And the common denominator in the sound and resonance that brought things into existence, the common denominator on planet Earth and the common denominator between humanity and all ancient cultures, is our obsession with gold. This brings us to the end of this episode, and the next episode we'll explore this obsession with gold, human history, human origins, and the reason for our obsession with gold, why we have this obsession, and that is almost impossible to separate humanity, our origins, and our obsession for this thing called gold. I'm Michael Tellinger, and thanks for watching.